Thank you. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. And hello online. Let us know if there are any issues. It looks like everyone can hear. So yes, as Claire said, we have 2 sessions now. And the first one is making us think about diachronic or historical perspectives in connection with synchronic or present-day sociolinguistic analysis. So we're actually going to focus on a website that we developed with our recent project, Generations of London English. And this session is just going to get you to engage with the website in some detail, do a few activities that the website allows, but you might have other thoughts to share about what's useful with it. And then in the second session, there's some kind of thematic link, because we'll then look at some results from our project in the next session, looking at teenage speech and how it's changing over a couple of decades. So, So this is the project website that we're going to be using. I won't keep switching between our slides and the website, so if you have a computer with you, feel free to have a look at it, but I'll also show you here. It actually would be useful if you're able to. You can also look at it on your phone when we get to looking at the site together. And the website that we developed is quite detailed. It's not intended just as a project website that tells you what we're doing. The 3 goals we had when we were developing the website were, first of all, to talk a little bit in general terms about theoretical ideas about language change. So not too much detail, but a kind of scaffolding for how we look at London speech today, also how we look at the city or a city like London over time. So one component is what I've called theory, but just thinking about language change in a productive way. One of the reasons for that is it relates a little bit to public discourse as well, where we sometimes see what's happening today around us as completely different to the past, or socially disrupted, or somehow exotic. And one of the main goals of this session is to show how we're just in another cycle of change. So the theoretical basis is quite useful to have in sight. And then 2 other areas of the website are dedicated to the historical perspective. So in this project, I'll give you more details as we go of what we're doing in the project, especially in the next session. But in this project, we are looking in real time at language changing, quite a short space, so 20 years in one part of the project, a few months in the case of kids that we're looking at. We're recording some kids every 6 months. But all of that is how language is varying and changing in real time. And so we wanted to include a deeper real-time picture in the website. So what I have here is diachronic, or the historical view we're going to look at together. One portion is London centuries ago, and one portion is London over the past century, the 20th century. And the second of these is a very important baseline for understanding what we see in our project and the analysis we're doing. And so the 3rd area that we cover with the website is what we see in London today, but with that contextualization. So we're going to, for this session, look at a couple of key concepts. And as I said, one of the goals is to put what we see in London today in the context of how language works. So we want to think in terms of cycles, not change as a linear, constantly evolving thing, but cycles that get affected by certain kinds of circumstances. So we're going to talk about what's sometimes been called actuation. So when do changes begin? When do they seem to go? We might not talk about them completing, but what's their life cycle? What's their, they have a little kind of life that's quite regular, and we'll see some examples of it. But a way to think about cyclical change is that the present is just the latest past. So it's not that exotic, and we'll try and kind of de-exotify even things that are quite new in London. And then along the way, we're also going to think about awareness of change, because we can't talk about these cycles of how languages change without thinking about whether people are aware of them. So it's quite a kind of big picture set of concepts, but hopefully both historical examples and examples from today will flesh that out. So the two main areas we're going to look at within the website, and I don't know how teachers feel about get your phones out as a teaching method, but I'm going to suggest it because it's useful if you're able to look through the website yourself. If you have a laptop, you could just go to the website. It's generationsoflondonenglish.org. And we'll do some tasks together that involve looking through the contents of these two areas. So we'll get to that in just a moment. So one area which relates back to the first of the three themes that I mentioned, theory, historical, and synchronic, is the more theoretical framework. It's not that detailed in terms of theory, it's more principles. So the section called How Language Works is one that gives us some scaffolding for thinking about English in London. And the other area we're going to work on in this session is called London English over time. So it feeds that abstract kind of frame with examples from the historical context. As I said, there's centuries, then generations in the 20th century, and then some material from today. So hopefully most of you can access it just for when we look at it together. So these are the two areas. There's other background information on there as well. And actually, eventually, we will put findings when we get to a certain point with analyses we're doing. We'll have some summaries of findings and links to papers as well. So let's start with a kind of lead-in for thinking about English in London. And we're going to start by brainstorming. This is something you can do with your students that it's sort of an easy way into starting to imagine voices of London. Some people are very familiar with Londoners or London or have a background from London. There are a lot of celebrities from London, so you get familiar with different voices, older and younger. So let's very briefly talk about a couple of these and then apply some of the ideas that come out to the website content. So just for a moment, these are really simple questions. So think about how well you know London, what kinds of accents you associate with London. It might be described in quite simple terms, might be quite specific, and also whether you associate some of those with specific parts of the city. And you may or may not, we won't spend too long on it. But just have a think, talk to each other for a moment, and then we'll see what you had. Okay, I know that was really brief, but we're going to keep going with these. So does any table want to, we'll just get a few examples out and keep going. Any table want to offer a couple of examples? Yeah, so we've got received pronunciation, voices. I'm glad you said that, because sometimes you go straight for the kind of stereotypical vernaculars, but that's very important. Any others? And you said which parts of town?
Like Islington, Chelsea.
Sure. Could be anywhere, actually. That's one of the things we need to keep in mind. So, we don't have complete separation, but yeah, great. Estuary English. And did you have any associations with it?
We were talking about basically how estuary is sort of like on a continuum somewhere between RP and Cockney.
Yeah.
So, and it's dependent on where people place themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And these like new royals and how they're putting themselves more towards estuary English rather than RP.
Yeah, exactly. It's often associated with the city, more central, but it could actually overlap with RP regions because it's a modified RP at one end. So yeah, estuary. Any others?
So
Cockney, East End. Anything else?
used to hear people say south of the river.
Excellent. I'm so glad South London, south of the river. So we have some voices. It's interesting how well known they are. So I'm sure for some of you, you know these. You may not have spent that much time in London. But let's keep these synchronic voices in mind, and then now try and go backwards in time a little bit. So this is a bit harder to, okay. Can you, let's do this together. So can you think of anything about the time dimension with London English? It's a bit tricky, so we'll just talk about it together. Some of what you described newer varieties or older varieties?
So ones where you've sort of picked 70s, 60s, 50s, whereas I imagine 100 years ago you had more of the Cockney Bow-Bells.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Cockney a bit older, Estuary famously 80s, 90s. Have you heard of Sloane Rangers? So we talked about RP. RP has different types, some more conservative, some more contemporary. And so let's pause with status and prestige because we'll come to examples of that. So keeping in mind both of these now, a kind of geographical picture, a little bit of London, types of voices, but also prestige and class. Try and think of a couple of celebrities, older, younger, different types. Just name a few who you think are Londoners. Can be from any generation. Just shout. Michael Caine.
Lily Allen.
Lily Allen, yeah, good. I'm not a Londoner myself, so I may not know of some that you mentioned, but any others that you think of? Famous Londoners? Adele. Nice. Stormzy, great. Rio Ferdinand, yeah, good. I don't think I have any footballers on the next slide. I should have. Okay, so they're kind of useful to think about because, especially if you're doing this with students, and in case students are struggling to or feel, less confident about knowing things about London, they will be able to plug in through the odd celebrity. There is another task available linked to the one we're talking about that I'm not going to go into, where students can also think about their own speech in this way, so these slight differences, or their own town, and how the same differences might be arising, if you want to branch out from that. But here are a few, I think we have one or two that you mentioned. West. So you can also give them some individuals. I think what's nice with celebrities is it really activates the voice. When you see the person, you think of David Attenborough's voice. Who can't do that? And then Hugh Grant, didn't grow up in Notting Hill, but Zadie Smith did. South, Michael Caine, I always think of him as an East Londoner, but apparently Southwark, or grew up around Southwark. John Boyega, Charlie Chaplin, Bernardine Evaristo, Amy, and then East, an interesting group, so both Alfred Hitchcock and David Beckham are from Leytonstone. Alfred Hitchcock's accent is very interesting because he kind of tailored it a lot in his lifetime, as famously Michael Caine retained his. Michaela Cole and Idris Elba are both from East London, and keep them in mind, more linked to the next session that we're doing, but they have some of the broader accent ranges that we see in celebrities, and something we'll come back to, how complex your speech system is, not just where, which region accent you have. So this gets us thinking about how complex speech in London is. One of the problems with looking at London or any place like this is we start to stereotype. So one thing we'll do at the end of the session when we listen to real voices is remind ourselves to always resist that overgeneralization or over-stereotyping. So for instance, because Idris Elba is from East London, we don't just assume he has X accent. He doesn't actually. He has a very wide range. So we'll come back to that. But this gives us, both a sense of space, a voice across spaces in London, but also a little bit time with some of the older figures. So we're going to now work through, go from this contemporary picture back in time, look at some of the content in the website, and start analyzing how London speech got to where it is, why it looks this way, with a kind of historical base. So we'll start with the broad principles. I'm going to get you to look through, if that works, online, if you can, look on your laptops or phones. It's generationsoflondonenglish.org. And I'll get you to look through the contents and pick out either examples or principles, and we'll put them together and apply them. So we're first going to look at the page on how does language change to get our principles in place, and then we're going to look at London language first in the deeper history over centuries, then generations, and come back to today. So let's start with how does language change. This isn't specific to London. It's to get an idea of this cyclical idea on the table. So if you can go to the how does language change page. I'm not going to switch my screen so that we don't disrupt the slides, but if it's under how language works, you'll see there are other categories that we're not talking about under that tab. So before we move on, and if you're online, don't look at the next slide. We want to kind of pull out these ideas. Have a look through how does language change and try to identify. There's quite a lot of, we've tried to keep it relatively readable, and I know it's a lot to read in a session like this, but if you can scroll through and for a minute and then just share with the group what principles you noticed. Yeah? If it helps, you can just note down a couple of concepts. In the end, we're going to aim for 3 or 4 key ideas. Paul and Sam can proofread for any typos. You've seen this text a lot. So, of course, this is partly just to introduce you to what's in there, so I don't want you to have to read for too long, but I don't know if you need more time. Were you able to pick out a few ideas from there? Anyone want to? We'll just mention them and then I have a slide to pull it together. Any ideas about how language changes that we want to take away?
The young drive change, and then that becomes normalised when they become the older generation, and that kind of cycle.
Yeah, that's one useful thing to remember, that we talk a lot about prestige of certain forms, and it is very lasting. We have our RP that kind of crosses generations, but actually young people, kids and young people, this is William Labov's original argument, will always hear what we hear as standard and unmarked as a little old. And that's a kind of engine for change. So that's one nice thing to keep in mind, that there's a generational effect. It can be quite constrained if you have very strong inhibition of change, like very formal standardization and imposition of standards. You'll inhibit that change, but still there's this natural source for cycles of change, things that seem very standard becoming marked as old. Anything else? Yes?
Random fluctuation transmission, so natural speech randomly vary it, and then that being transmitted.
Yeah.
And then that accelerate radius scale.
Yeah, exactly. That's great. I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's harder. We're not looking at it in as much detail, but we often see contact-based change, and we're going to look at that a lot now. But there's also internal flux in language that's the source of a lot of changes. So languages are just generally often balancing themselves out or leveling something out, and then that can pick up. So there's a mention on the website of internal and external sources of change, and both are at play often. Anything else? These are actually 2 of the main points, and I guess you'll have. Yeah, we talked about awareness a little bit. So let me list them out. So we want to think in terms of these cycles now when we look at London. So we have a kind of beginning of a change. Often people aren't aware. So you mentioned random fluctuations. Often people, these changes start to pick up. Kids are doing their thing, languages are doing their thing, and we don't realize. And sometimes they just go through and change and nobody notice. That can happen. Sometimes they're above the level of awareness. That's more often linked to prestige. The behavior of that will be slightly different. You can use the term actuation. It's a bit technical. It's kind of just the start of changes. So we can have these being generated from different sources. And then we get a steady uptake, which we won't go into too much today. But then there's an interesting interaction with awareness. So William Labov has a very nice description of how whatever changes are happening, that awareness has its own cycle as well. So he says, in this quote, communities differ in the extent to which they stigmatize new forms, but I've never yet met someone who greeted them with applause. No one's been heard to say, it's wonderful the way young people talk today, so much better than the way we talked. Language change is interpreted as nonconformity, and so you can get awareness, and we're going to see a lot of this in this session and the next session. But coming back to the point that you brought out in the beginning, you might think, oh, well, young people produce these new ways of speaking, and now, you know, the language has gone to the dogs, it's terrible. But those people grow up and become the new, you know, employers and parents, and then that speech, the people who had those attitudes are gone, and their speech goes through this normalization process. So there's this interaction with awareness that's quite generational. So for now, let's keep these in mind. Does that make sense, the kind of cycle, rather than just change is kind of going along in some linear sense? So let's dive into centuries ago to start with, and then work our way back to the 20th century. So now we're going to switch over to English over the centuries. So this is under Language in London. Is that what? London English over time, and then the over centuries tab. And we're going to do a slightly more extended activity with this. So we've got a few concepts in mind, that there's going to be a cycle of change. We'll have some kind of starting point. It's going to be more contact for the examples we're looking at now. So look for initiation of some change in language through contact of different kinds. It doesn't mean it's always someone coming from outside the national level. It can also be small scale. Triggering some changes, awareness shifting, and then gradual unmarking, which is something we talk about less. So again, now, if you look through, and of course, as I said, there's a lot of text there for you. It's meant for you to be able to dive in later and use. But if you want to, you could jump around to your favorite century or your favorite period of English. But try to, this is a little kind of recap of the history of English in 1,000 words or whatever on this page. But what you should do as an activity to apply these concepts is look for evidence of them in the history of English. So I'm not asking you to read the whole thing, but take a few minutes to look through and try and find moments where a new change seems to be starting of some kind. It's not going to be a specific linguistic change, but change in English. And then how maybe attitudes are, people are becoming aware, stigmatizing or valorizing, and then kind of it merging into standard usage because that declines. So we'll take a few minutes again and see what you pick out. Again, sorry, there's quite a lot so that you can use it how you like, but try to pick out a few examples. So maybe we can go through these categories and try and pick out examples. So let's first just think about this compact history of English in London in relation to contact or some kind of social change, triggering change. Did you pick out any examples? So there are boxes with some examples as well, and the chronological timeline. Are there clear cases where you can see linguistic change being triggered by contact or other social disruption or change? Yeah.
I'm just on the immigration and the 19th century
Mm-hmm.
section. Just interested in saying sort of the Cockney at the east end of London, that you've got this kind of history of a melting pot of lots of different groups. You've got borrowed words that have still existed today from the Romani, from
Yes.
from the military officers coming back with words from Yiddish.
Yeah.
Kind of that idea that we've always had a particular area of London that's been really multicultural.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's, I'm so glad you picked that one out. That's one example where in the media especially, you see a real opposition between multicultural London English and Cockney. Paul has written about this in a lot of detail. There's a kind of romanticization of Cockney as pure English. And it wasn't romanticized until there was a new enemy that's arrived. And so it's an example that shows, again, that it's not just cycles in a general sense. Literally the same process has happened before. The same for Middle English. Some of you might have picked out that Middle English is an example of this, but in the same spot. And why in that spot?
If someone didn't know what that was, but you gave them the titles Cockney or Multicultural London English, they'd put that title on the definition of Cockney.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm Indian originally, and I love all the Indian. I mean, for Indians, they're always, Indians will say, what's all this Hindi doing in Cockney? But British English speakers won't, it's quite integrated phonologically, so you don't realize how much comes from the military colonial route. So yeah, so it has, I mean, to different degrees. So again, Paul, much more than me, has written about there are big differences. So we don't want to say they're the same thing. The way the phonology developed is very different. The circumstances of it developing. But why in East London? Both docks. Yeah, so how people arrived, especially when the river was the primary way of coming in. So actually, I've worked on British Asian English, and it developed in West London because especially Gujarati, so Indians who left East Africa and moved in the 70s in large numbers, short period of time, because they were expelled from East Africa, arrived by air. So it changed the geography of where change happens in London, and they were actually housed near the airport. So interesting history, because India wouldn't take them, and the UK took them. So they were overseas British nationals at that time. And so it's a very interesting history that they were actually able to come to the UK rather than go to India. And then they were housed around Heathrow, and they got jobs working in Heathrow, and Heathrow has a lot of Asian employees, but it's a little history of West London. And so before Heathrow was there, you wouldn't have expected that much linguistic change there. So quite interesting to understand that the location of change is not arbitrary at all, but quite related to the sociology and transport. So any other, going back, sorry, I skipped ahead, any other examples of contact or social disruption as a trigger for change in London from what you browsed?
You have the arrival of Norman French.
Yes.
The shift to go, so you had the Chaucer reference where she was trying to sound sophisticated by using French with an accent.
Yeah, so she speaks French after the school of Stratford at Bow. So it's a nice, because Anglo-Norman was a whole variety, we're talking about English here, but a whole variety that had its own stigmatized status in some contexts. So yeah, so this period, so the arrival of French, and both social disruption or social trauma even, and then also the linguistic disruption, I mean, you know this very well, so I won't go into it in detail, is a huge trigger for all kinds of linguistic change as well. But here again, there are Dutch speakers, French speakers. There was a huge, much more international context in Middle English than people think. So a colleague of mine, Marion Turner, writes about Chaucer and has written a whole book on how global his work is, and the context was how much international exchange there was. So again, you know, moving away from a kind of qualitative contrast between the history of English and then now having a lot of contact and migration, that actually even going further back than Cockney, going back to Middle English, we have this as well. Anything else with contact or social change that you might have noticed? Yeah.
This is actually a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got the one here about Elizabethan cant.
Yeah.
What's the specific link to?
Great.
Like, what's the perceived sort of driver of that particular change? Because
Yeah.
if you'd have asked me about that before, I'd have put that in the 17th century with the upheaval and the. I would have miscategorised that in the wrong one, essentially. So.
Well, I shouldn't. So not miscategorized. So it's also me imposing some, putting it in a box. So of course these continue, and you're probably thinking of, the continuing life of this. It's sometimes called Elizabethan, the early stage of it. I'm very glad you mentioned it because it's a very different type of language formation, which I mentioned, I think, here, the term anti-language. So here it's coming out of much more extreme separation of poverty and working class subcultures from not just the elites, but even not yet middle classes, but somewhat middle classes. So the legal history at that time is quite wild. I'm sure you know about it, but how now we live in a time when people have relatively similar rights legally, but people didn't then. So you could just be picked up as a poor person and charged very differently to someone with resources and a title and so on. So these anti-languages were a kind of protection for trade, whatever it might be, trade on the margins of what was permitted, or just being able to function without being bothered. So anti-languages are much more circumscribed than what we talked about Cockney and MLE as this very natural process of language change, but Kant, and also we'll get to, I was trying to remember where I put it, we'll get to, MLE is sometimes called slang, but we really need to separate slang from new dialect and new accent. So there is slang within MLE. Again, Paul can comment on all this in much more detail. But you can have slang that's specifically designed to be opaque, so that people don't know. And but we don't want to mix that up with regular change. But this shows that both types are both historical and contemporary. Yes.
What are sort of original sources, texts and things for Elizabethan cant? Where do we find them? In the 18th century, there are slang dictionaries and things like that emerging.
Yeah, so there were canting dictionaries, 17th century canting dictionaries. I can send, if you email me, I can send some references. They are sometimes covered in History of English books, but maybe if you email me. But you mean the original texts or sources that talk about them? Yeah. So some of the earliest dictionaries were hard words and dark words and words, like don't get ripped off kind of dictionaries, like don't get taken, like a lot of it was things like language for loaded dice and horse thieves language. So thieves cant was a whole kind of space of fear that you can't understand what's going on around you, and that evolved into the more kind of aspirational hard words to sound sophisticated, and that evolved into dictionaries as we know them. So yeah, I think the earliest dictionaries of these are maybe late 16th, early 17th century. But yeah, like a kind of prurient interest in the underworld. So I'm glad you mentioned it because it's good to keep apart these two different kinds of language development. So I've got slightly randomly selected boxes here from the website, but Chancery Standard is up here, so I'll just mention that this is also on the over the centuries list because we also have cycles of standardization. So it's, again, not linear that we just got a standard and then that remained in place. We have early, we don't have as much standardization, and then it develops. So late medieval, the Chancery in London started to be a source for a standard, but not quite as pinned down as by the 18th century. Okay, so I might just... Yeah, so hopefully you saw as well when you were going through this that you can see how the contact and change is much more salient for us as historians when we look back. But it's good to note, it's almost implicit in the page that you read, that those shocking new ways of speaking became unmarked because they became English, you know. So it's good to keep that in mind when you're talking about change generally. So we see Middle English, for instance. We're going to do some more Middle English briefly in the next session. But when you see Middle English, it's actually hugely changed. There was a lot of variation at that time, and people were uncomfortable with it. But then eventually, especially with printing, it settled down, and the shock of how much the language had changed just wore off. And so it's good to keep, it's harder to see that because it's you know, it's just the continued life of the language that shows us. People stopped caring about that and moved their attention to something else that they hated about change. So we have that unmarking process as well. So switching briefly to the generations page. So we're coming up in time towards London today. If you could just switch over, we won't spend as much time on it, but I'll just show you. Switch over to the over generations. This is still on London English over time, but over generations. Yeah, so that's the last century. We've come zoomed in, and there's much more detail decade by decade now. And for understanding the analysis of London speech today, for MLE work that you might be talking about, that history of the last 100 years is really crucial. You can kind of misread what's happening in some ways without that. So if you have a look there, maybe looking at the time, we won't do this in too much detail, but you can again actually, even within one century, look for a few little cycles of change in London being generated by migration patterns changing, by social mobility, for instance. So it's sort of mirroring what we talked about at the level of centuries. You see the same thing even at the level of decades. We are going to pick up some of this directly in the next session when we look at what we're finding for MLE. So with this one, I might just show you a couple of these blocks so that we can look at the London Today page just for a couple of minutes. So here we have just, maybe it's also just helpful for students to have some of these more general descriptions of standard and vernacular. Received pronunciation, we don't want to not romanticize, but I guess have a caricature of RP as unchanging. RP keeps changing as well. I think in the toolkit there's a piece on the Queen's speech changing. So you know, RP changes a bit less, but it's also had these cycles. So we talked about some of these. In the generations page, one thing that we won't go into, but that is very important, is the sequence of arrivals. That's something we'll pick up in the next session, when different groups arrived. So when we look at London, and we look at London a lot because in a way it's the crucible of some big changes that then spread out. Not all of English is generated by London variation, but some of it comes from there. We want to not just say, oh, loads of people arrived in London and everything got, it's not at all like that. And we want to get familiar with the sequence of arrivals, how people arrived. We just talked about East and West arrivals, Asians, East London migration, because it actually, we'll see in the next session in some detail, it is the basis of why the accent has the features it has. Paul has written about this a lot as well. So when you scroll through the generations page, one thing it's providing you with is a compact profile of how the inputs to contemporary London varieties came in at different times. What came before one input actually makes a difference to what young people start picking up around them. Okay, so the last page, and we'll just do a bit of listening if it works. Together is London Today. So if you go to that in the same section of London English over time, the last tab in the drop-down is called London Today. That provides you with clips from our project from different parts of London. I'll tell you more about the project in the next session, but our project focused on East London because one thing we were doing was following up the original MLE projects. Eliza, Sam, Paul are all on the project with some others, and so one component was actually what I'll talk about in the next session. So we had to focus more on East London, but we did also record in the south and a little bit around other parts of London. So this resource, something I would, maybe rather than playing too many clips, is if you could have a look at London Today and maybe talk about how you might use it and also how it links to what we just talked about. So you'll see that you can see from the descriptions actually that these recordings are from, it's not to show that everyone in East London sounds the same. It's trying to push you to show that actually every part of London has a layering of types of speech. So you could have a look. So have a look, I think first have a look and maybe you could share how you might use it, either related to what we just talked about understanding that this is just part of the cycles of change, or other uses that you think would be useful. Let's do that just for a minute and you could exchange with each other how you might use that. I decided not to go into the website. We have listening for the next. Yeah, so Sam reminded me to say that the transcript of a couple of them, all the Newham ones, all of the Newham recordings have transcripts in the exercises extensions documents. So if you're listening, you can listen. It might get kind of noisy, but you could have a listen. But there are transcripts, at least for the Newham ones, if you want to have a look. This is the page that you're seeing is just one of different boroughs that are on the website. Was that what you were asking? So we just have a couple of minutes. I thought it might be nice to get you to talk about, so you were listening in the front. I thought we'll just talk a little bit. I don't want to switch to go into the website and play this to you just because we'll use all our time trying to switch between pages. But did you have any comments as you were listening a little bit?
There's a couple of things. We noticed a couple of things where we teach in Manchester. Mm-hmm. Some of our students have got some of the same, to me, seem similar features to some of the young men talking in New.
Ah, that's great.
From, again, different backgrounds as well.
So just saying for everyone online that the comment was listening to were you listening to Newham? So there are different boroughs on the website.
Newham, the first clip where you've got students from different, Vietnamese, South Asian, Ghanaian backgrounds.
Yeah.
We would say to some of the young men in our college, which is Manchester, seem to have some of those things going on.
So just saying for everyone online that kids in Manchester have some shared features with some of the first Newham recording. It's great that you mentioned that. There is research on that. Rob Drummond and others have written about it. And it's so interesting that you can hear them. A nice exercise if you're teaching in Manchester is to pick out which features, it won't all be the same, which are similar, but glottal stops. Yeah. Some must be more, I think, maybe, if you're hearing with that recording, because it's got quite a lot of MLE.
Yeah.
Maybe lexicon?
Yes, definitely.
Certainly bro. Bro has just gone global. But I'll say a couple of things about linking to the historical perspective in a minute, but any other observations that you have? I know we haven't listened together, but about how you might use these?
We were just saying about the gender. We get the white girl from Newham, I think, and your findings about it being suggesting that it's more a male thing that's going on. So we were talking about how we could obviously
talk about gender, yeah. And so in the next session, we'll look at Paul's original data and then almost 20 years on now, and we see very regular gendering. So it's been, quite consistent from the beginning. So it would be quite a a kind of tidy gender story. But again, it's good to look at some of the details. But it's very interesting how at least for our data, the younger teenage white British heritage girls being the most traditional. Not completely, but more than the boys, partly because of the multi-ethnoleg being more masculine, so the white boys have moved more towards it. So if you're interested in Lebov's general theories of variation, we might actually predict that the boys are the most vernacular, and so it's the girls. So we can see why it's that way, and we'll get to that in the next session. But yeah, so there's gender that you can talk about in there. Anything else that people notice that you might use it for? You can use it. I don't know how much you talk about. So I guess Sam and Eliza were talking about prosody, but there's a lot of, since these are voice clips, you can do a lot with phonetic variation, intonation, also register. Some of them are speaking a little more formally, some are speaking with their friends. Maybe just to end with a link back to, we went quite far back historically and then came to the present day, but one way to talk about them, because we've selected clips from around London to show some surprises, we didn't want to put clips that sound like everybody in East London uses MLE. It's not at all the case. Similarly for South London. But you can see some ethnic differences in the data, but you can also think of it in terms of waves of change going through communities. So you'll hear that across London, some of them share features, but then in some parts it's very ethnically specific. So you can talk about, in relation to the longer history, well, this group seems to just be isolated from that group, and so that change is not spreading across, whereas some other feature is going, it's like Bro is a good example, actually, that why has it spread across everybody, whereas others are quite specific. So you can kind of historicize the diversity that you see. And try and, it's difficult, it's what we do for a living, it's difficult to pin down, but I think the diversity, although it sounds messy at first, you can talk about it as cycles of change going through these communities. All right, so there's a third task that we're done in terms of time now, but just mentioning that there's a third task in the extension tasks that you have online, and this one is a nice example of doing some searches on your own for students to do on their own, where they pick out a feature of language and see how it might be going through a cycle of maybe coming out of the vernacular, becoming standardized. And there's a little explanation there, going back to the anti-language, that sometimes what I've been talking about is more about regular change in sound and grammar, maybe discourse markers, intensifiers. But sometimes slang words, so yap is a bit ambiguous, but slang will behave a little differently because it has a different social function. So one feature of slang is it tends to cycle faster than the examples we've been talking about, like accent features, which take their time. But these are, I haven't got the whole task up here, but there's a list later in the task where you can look at some grammatical features, search, see over time how they're changing, and whether they're going through some of these cycles as well. So I think I better stop. So just a reminder that we've kind of tried to apply a cyclic idea of language change. One of the goals is to de-exotify contemporary variation, not only hear it as people coming in with other language. I know I'm doing a bit of a Daily Mail kind of framing, but it is easy to slip into that because there has been a lot of diversification of communities in a city like London. But it's very important to understand that change has these cycles, especially London has always had that outside influence, and that awareness has this cycle as well. So I will stop there. Yeah? Thank you. I guess we can do a couple of questions, I think. there's a question about what was the source of old pronouncing dictionaries, which is a good question. It's hard to say. I mean, I think it's from observation, but it's just by the author. These old historic dictionaries are just... Nowadays, dictionaries use a lot of crowdsourced material, but I think it was, yeah, just to respond to that. Any other questions or
There was
comments?
a comment earlier in the chat about how it's really hard to write about random fluctuation.
Yeah.
And that one of the teachers was saying that he kind of stopped teaching that in the classroom because it was kind of hard to say much about it.
I saw that. It's such a good point, actually. I was thinking I mean, I haven't focused on it with this because with London, we're kind of looking at social churn. But there actually, I'm wondering if you can think of good examples. So, what's that? One example, I'm looking at Paul, it's not random fluctuations, but it's internal structure, is diphthongs. We're going to look at them in the next session, but some vowels change with other vowels. So there's like internal structure. They're called chain shifts. You might have read about them. So I think it's not random fluctuation at all, but it is an example where it's not just a basket. Language is like a bucket, and we have external influences, and then we just... There's all this internal structure that can also resist change. So there's a whole theory in phonology that says actually phonological change is very slow because it has all this internal, you have to have contrasts to be able to understand each other. And so that will resist some outside change. So although it's not random fluctuation, I think it's a good area to use for internal sources of change or lack of change. We will see an example of this a little bit in the next session. But yeah, I mean, random fluctuations are actually another good general principle that's possible to say. I think, again, I don't know why I'm saying this in front of phonologists and politicians, is that sometimes if the whole phonology system gets imbalanced, it'll want to balance out. So we don't like gaps in the space. I don't know if you would want to say more. So sometimes you'll get a balancing out or a leveling out or even verb forms where it's a little bit that flux leading to balancing that's nothing to do with whether Normans have arrived. So it's actually quite an important part of language change, but it's a very good point that it's hard to point to those. I think it's kind of a force that's always keeping language in a lovely kind of functional balance that we don't notice that much. Okay, maybe we should take a short break because you're going to hear me again, and maybe, 2 minutes, and then I'll switch.